Justice is done, it is a joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers. And I like the New American Standard Version. The exercise of justice is joy for the righteous, but is terror to the workers of iniquity. And so what we find when so many of the agendas of our day's culture are driven by, quote, workers of iniquity, based on this verse, do they really want justice? God's told us those people abhor justice. When justice actually happens, those are the people who will run fleeing because they know they're the ones who will suffer. And so likewise, we as God's people should be the people who want justice to be done and seen and known more than anyone, because it is that which comes from God and that which will glorify God when justice is carried out. Because we know of His character and His mercy, we should want others to see His will and His justice done. Since injustice is a matter of doing wrong, a wrong judgment, God has always promised to right it. And so since God has revealed to us that He is the God of all, He will exact vengeance on all who exercise injustice against mankind. So we turn our attention to the book of Amos tonight. I invite you to turn to Amos chapter 1. Amos chapter 1, look at verse number 1. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. So the latter part of the verse tells us the time frame in which he's serving, which is before the Assyrians are going to come in and take out the northern kingdom of Israel. But notice, they list the king Uzziah of Judah first because Amos comes from Judah. But the message he's carrying is to Israel, the northern kingdom. All right, so he is a shepherd, and he's going to northern kingdom Israel to warn them, to tell them of God's righteous wrath and warning against them. So those two key facts are just helpful moving forward into the book. Amos is a shepherd. That's why later he's going to say, I was not the son of a shepherd. I was not the son of a prophet. I'm not a prophet. He was a shepherd. But he was sent on this mission with this message to the northern kingdom of Israel with these things. Now verse 2. And he said, the Lord roars from Zion and utters His voice from Jerusalem. So the message is coming from Judah. He's from Judah. The temple's in Judah. But it's a message to northern kingdom Israel largely. And it roars throughout the pastures of the shepherds because they mourn. And it goes to the top of Carmel, the mountain there in northern kingdom Israel. It withers. Now what's interesting about the word roars is that typically when you read the word roars in the Old Testament, it's probably referring to lightning or thunder caused by the strike of lightning, the sound. And yet in this book, what we find is the emphasis on the imagery of a lion. You get to chapter 3 and verse number 8. The Lord God does nothing without revealing His secret to His servants, the prophets. The lion has roared. Who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken. Who can but prophesy? So here's a glimpse for us to see the message of God coming to Israel eventually is like a roaring lion. Now put the picture together. Amos is a shepherd warning about the voice of the Lord, which is pictured as a lion. There's danger coming. But danger is not coming just as a nation around you. Danger is coming as the voice of the Lord because you have set yourselves against the Lord. It's a warning about getting right with Him. Else, you'll suffer the fate of punishment at the hands of God. So what happens now is that before he gets to Israel, specifically with their injustices against God and against one another, he chronicles 7 neighbors all around Israel. It's kind of interesting take. He doesn't start with Israel. He starts with Damascus or Syria. And so chapter 1, the rest of chapter 1 and into chapter 2 are 7 different neighbors of northern kingdom Israel. So all of those he's going to recount. Here's how you are practicing injustice, and thus you have punishment awaiting you, even though it's to the northern kingdom, Israel. So let's go through those 7 first. That'll be our main emphasis tonight. The first neighboring nation is Damascus, nation of Syria. Their capital was Damascus. And the charge against them is summarized by saying, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. A threshing device was, of course, used in agriculture and farming to separate the wheat from the chaff. Big, heavy device that contains pieces of stone or iron that would fall down and crush it all and separate it all. Prior to that, it would be animals that would stomp on it, and they figured out, hey, we can duplicate this with a big device. There are some who suggest that perhaps the Syrians were doing this with people. There's not really a lot of evidence to that. But the idea is that when they decided to take over an area, they go conquer this city or that city. In this case, it's Gilead. It was like the area had been threshed. They destroyed everything and everybody in their path. Even in conquering lands, they didn't take any mercy. They just destroyed it. You hear when a tornado hits, it looked like a bomb went off. Well, that's similar imagery. They can't just simply go conquer it with as little effort as possible. They thoroughly destroy it. So God is saying, you will answer to me, Damascus, pagan people, because of your injustice toward each other. Gilead shared a border with Israel, so no doubt Israel would have shared and known about Syria's interactions with Gilead and how they had thoroughly defeated them. But then next he talks to those in Gaza, which would include the Philistines, and he has aught against them. They're practicing injustice because they carried into exile a whole people to deliver them up to Edom. Forced slavery. In Bible times, you had voluntary slavery, which was not as cruel and terrible kind of slavery, but this is bad slavery. This is forced, kidnapping slavery. Well, the Philistines were guilty of carrying whole people, all the people, and carrying them over to the Edomites. And so they were guilty of this heinous sin against God and against his creation. Edomites probably used them for forced labor, like their mines, their copper mines, and other metal iron mines, which would have been hard work and dangerous work upon them. Tyre is next, and they did similar. They delivered up a whole people to Edom, and they did not remember the covenant of brotherhood. So they're guilty of, again, kidnapping, slavery, and they turned their back on a covenant. Most likely what this is talking about is how the king of Tyre, Hiram, agreed to a covenant with King Solomon back when he was reigning over the United Kingdom. They provided materials for the temple. They had this treaty, this agreement to be nice to one another. Well, now they've gone back on these agreements and are punishing people in this area, living beyond the scope of God and his own justice. Then you get to the Edomites next. And it simply says, because he pursued his brother with the sword. This is fascinating because the Edomites were descendants of Esau. And so there's perpetual fighting between Israel and Judah since this split between Jacob and Esau. The text goes on to say they were angered perpetually. They kept wrath forever. There was endless treachery. You'll notice they are mentioned in conjunction with 4 of the 6 other foreign prophecies in this section of the book. But notice, the reason he's upset at Edom is not because they are, quote, against Israel. That would be surface level. He's upset with the Edomites because they mistreat people. You are constantly pursuing other people. It doesn't specify which brother. You're constantly in fighting with everyone else. Isn't it interesting? They're mentioned in 4 of these 6 foreign nation prophecies. And so what this reminds us of is that God's vengeance is not petty, but instead it's true because you're mistreating people. 5th, Ammonites begins to get even more graphic because they have ripped open pregnant women in Gilead. They were willing to attack the most vulnerable in order to expand their borders of territory. For the Ammonites, there was no safe place because of their brutality. They were willing to say these vulnerable mothers and their babies inside their wombs, we will pounce down upon them in order to exact our revenge on the peoples we're conquering. Then number 6, the Moabites. They burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom. There's Edom again. Well, there was a battle in which they killed the king of Edom, and they weren't satisfied to just kill him. They dismembered him, and they treated his body after death with grave treatment. They mutilated him, and it's insightful that, again, this is the most specific victim and the most specific mistreatment or injustice from these first 4 and 6. And again, it's not against Israel. It's not even against Judah. God is saying it's not just because my people are suffering, it's because any people are suffering that now this has arisen to my throne and received my attention. Then number 7, the foreign enemy, quote, foreign people, foreign neighbor around Israel is in fact Judah, the southern kingdom. So before he gets to the northern kingdom of Israel, he's going to say, here's this prophecy against Judah. Why? Because they have rejected the law of the Lord and have not kept his statutes. God is addressing all of Israel's neighbors. He also includes Judah, which of course contains his own people and even the temple there in Jerusalem. Now, in addition to other grievances of injustice, Judah has rejected the law given to them by God. And it's the reason for the other injustices, because they have turned their back on him. The law is God's gift to them for their good, and they have rejected it. It represents God's covenant for them. It guides their actions toward one another, and they have ignored it. And so to ignore God's law is to ignore the source of just treatment. It was through the law they knew of God and his goodness toward them. Isn't it fitting and interesting that Amos is from Judah? He's going north and giving this message to northern kingdom Israel, and it also includes him being able to say, or having to say, I've got a warning for my own people. See, God's not petty in calling out injustice. God is consistent. He judges always with impartiality, and that includes even the southern kingdom that has remained more faithful to him than the northern kingdom. But he still has aught against them for leaving him. So this reminds us of a few things. The thorough treatment of injustices in Israel's neighbors, all of them, and 7, not a coincidental number there, shows clearly that God is right. He is right to judge justly all nations and all peoples. So the aim would be not to catch them off guard in a gotcha kind of manner, but for them, the northern kingdom Israel, to hear these offenses and say, wow, if those things are happening, if people are suffering, if those nations have turned against God, I should want God's justice to be done. And thus, hopefully get them to turn inward to say, I want to do what's right and be an instrument of God's justice just the same. That's where the book's going to turn in chapter 2. They've got plenty against them, and we'll get to that in future weeks. But we need to see here that God wants justice done no matter where people live. God does not tolerate reckless violence, as one author called it, which is kind of the common thread between all of these foreign enemies. So, he's setting an authentic, clear case for these nations to come back to him upon hearing Amos's message. Their fathers, when they moved into the land, did not run all the peoples out of the lands as they were supposed to. So now they're having to deal with the consequences. So many of the grievances of Judah, and then in a moment in the book Israel, have come because they have compromised, assimilated with these peoples around them. The message should always be the same. Do not fear these external enemies, because they too will answer to God. And also do not become like them or seek to be accepted by them, because they do reject God. So where's our application as we connect this to cultural situations? We must get to where Amos gets, which is to look inward, to assess our own obedience. But there is a need for us as the people of God, wanting to see the justice of God carried out. There is a time and a place and a necessary role for us to look at all of these issues and see where God's justice is being ignored, to see where injustices are happening, so that we can be the voice of those who are suffering, those who are being mistreated. And so we're not doing this in order to kind of beat up on culture, but to say where sin reigns, people suffer. And we as the church need to look for, not just listen to what's said about them, but actually look honestly at evidence and at people we know in specific situations, to look for injustice when it happens, so that we can be the ones who show love, right? Just because someone on the news says, hey, this is an act of injustice, doesn't mean that it is. But when we look into situations and meet the lives of people, we can be the source of God's love and justice for all. So let's look at a few of these main flashpoint issues. Every flashpoint issue of controversy, issue which we're going to have to face and study through, it ultimately ends up being an issue of justice. And we as God's people, God's own redeemed, saved people, should want true justice to be seen, known, and carried out everywhere. All right, so let's start just alphabetically. Most logical, perhaps, place is abortion. Where does injustice happen? Well, clearly, it's happening immediately in the lives of those unborn children who are exterminated. It's unjust. It's wrong for them to never have the breath of life. We can go further and dig into how this all happens and see that there are multiple injustices happening to make this a thriving business that it is. And after those babies, the next most suffering group of people are often the mothers involved. Men and the big business behind it that's funding all this and making money off of it, they're the ones who suffer the least, rarely suffer at all. Men are enabled to be sexually irresponsible through the act of injustice. And to be a people who claim to love women and to say this is an act of loving women is wrong. It's a sleight of hand because men are able to do what they want to do at the expense of women and unborn children. But then also we consider the moral revolution as it relates to the LGBTQ plus agenda. Where is that an act? How is this an act of justice or injustice? It's commonly portrayed as though nobody suffers, nobody hurts. It's just people doing what they love, and this is maybe, they would say, this is how they're created, and yet we recognize people always suffer when sin is allowed to reign. There's a high correlation, a growing trend, especially the younger generations, with mental illness and these things. So why would we push and advertise and try to convince a lifestyle that is correlated with mental illness? Why is there an agenda not just to broadcast it to the world, but specifically to inject it in the lives of our children long before they're able to mature? That's an act of injustice against children. Children are the ones who suffer because of this kind of thinking and agenda. It's not a victimless crime. Racism obviously comes to the surface quickly when we talk about justice and injustice. Some of that's because the term is being abused. Just because race is involved doesn't mean it's automatically a racist crime. But neither should we pretend that we're above the sin of racism. Both things can be true. We can be vulnerable to that sin, even though every time it's mentioned, it's not always what's happening. And we must be aware that that's been a common, maybe the common test and struggle of any culture and every culture to have lived. How to handle people who are different, who look different, who sound different, who have cultural differences. And so we must do our due diligence to look inward to our hearts and be sure that we're not guilty of judgments and stereotypes that would lead to different behaviors and lead to mistreatment and allow injustice to continue in some of these areas. It's especially important in light of the previous issue with the homosexual and trans movement, because the race connection is often used as a means of argumentation. See, you people are you were against other people for how they looked several decades ago, and now you're doing the same thing because of how people practice their lives now. Are we sure we're not guilty of some of those injustices first? But are we able to then say it is different? That we're able to say this is not a characteristic with which people are born, it's instead a choice. And people are born different, and that's a beautiful thing when it comes to race, nationality, and appearance. And so we must know the difference so that we can show the love of God and be able to discuss the will of God with all people who are involved. Medical technology continues to advance faster than we can keep up. And there's very much an issue of justice at the heart of all this. Are people being mistreated just because we have the capability of introducing some new technology? That is a treatment, a procedure, just because it can be done, does that automatically mean that it respects life? That it's carrying out the will of God in life? And so we must be aware from the starting point that the overwhelming majority of labs, researchers, medical technology companies do not start with godly values and a God-first worldview. The tests, the treatments they push, despite oftentimes the correlation with improving our health, they will not be held to the same standards of justice God reveals. They're not going to open the Bible and say, well, should we continue with this treatment or should we do this treatment? So that puts it upon us to look through the lens of everything that advances and every new thing that comes on the stage, to look at it through the lens of God. When embryos are destroyed just for the sake of infertility treatments, it's an act of injustice. When elderly sick people are encouraged to take their own lives, say for instance via euthanasia, that's an act of injustice. When outcomes take precedence over respect for life, we can guarantee there will be injustices. Another area that's closely connected to medical technology is this booming, really just the past few months, idea of artificial intelligence in terms of being available on a one-on-one kind of consumer level. Computers that run with these scripts, and supposedly every answer is unique and different, and it's all generated by computers. But here's the thing. There's no such thing as a truly robotic or computer programmed voice. They all have people behind them at some point. And so these chat scripts or these, it came up with Daniel the other night about some technology that offers to diagnose and offer treatment kind of options just artificially intelligence-wise. Well, all those scripts are programmed by a person or by people or by boards of organizations. So there's no way to guarantee that this is completely, quote, computer generated. So those people's biases will win out. Do we trust how they program the program? Do we trust how they program the robot? We can guarantee injustices will happen when computers are allowed to make decisions based on what other people have told it to do. Guess who gets off without consequence when that happens? The people who programmed the computer. Well, it's just a computer. It's just a chat. It's just a bot. That's ripe for abuse and thus mistreatment of other people. Finally, gambling continues just to rise and skyrocket in terms of addiction because of its availability on smartphone devices, and the state is getting more and more involved in this in terms of lotteries and sports gaming. And just think of the injustice that happened because the house always wins. Mathematically, the house always wins. Someone must lose in order for the house to win. And so people will spend their hard-earned money in this capacity instead of saving it, instead of taking care of their families, and they're vulnerable, and they're taken advantage of in the hope of a giant windfall. It becomes even more unjust when good organizations or good causes are dangled around as the motivation for carrying it out. You can talk with people involved in those kind of political conversations, and they say all these scholarships that get the headlines, hey, gambling pays for this scholarship, they have to get money from other places because the gambling proceeds don't actually meet that purpose. So nobody's profiting except for, quote, the house. And now we're getting to see where states and governments are becoming the house themselves. So we cannot sit idly by and say, well, this is okay to happen when people are suffering, souls are suffering, children are suffering because of these crimes. There's no such thing as a victimless crime, victimless sin. When sin happens, we push the consequences and irresponsibility on down the line. We'll see that in our culture with everything that they throw at us. And since this is true, we must be aware that we're not guilty of enabling or ignoring these injustices, and that we don't want to appease the ones who might try to oppress just out of a desire to be accepted by them. When we stand up and we speak up for injustices, it's for the sake of souls. Souls that are made in the image of God, and souls that we long for to obey God and to know God, not just for the sake of winning an argument or being, quote, right. We're going to answer to God for how we live in this generation with all of its difficulties and its challenges. Jesus would talk about justice in an important way. He would call the Pharisees hypocrites. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin. That's good to do. And yet you have neglected the weightier matters of the law, which are justice and mercy and faithfulness. These, the weightier matters, you ought to have done without neglecting the others. Keep doing your giving and your generosity. Keep parsing all of these valuable herbs as you've been doing, but not at the neglect of justice and mercy and faithfulness. What do you get? You are blind guides. Blind to the will of God. You're straining out a gnat while swallowing a camel. And so we must not be guilty of the same. We must have the courage to see through the screaming arguments, the emotions that get kicked up and riled up, and to look for the vulnerable, to look for the suffering, and do our best to be a voice for them so that they can come to know God and God can be seen in this world. We recognize, as we mentioned from James chapter 2 and chapter 4, that the starting point for justice is remembering that we're all going to stand before the true judge, the just judge. There was a college professor, a very difficult class, a logic class, and he was known for having an extremely difficult final exam, so he told his students, you can bring in one piece of paper, 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and whatever you can put on that sheet of paper, you can use to help you on your test. And so for years, people would bring in their one sheet of paper they had written out in tiny of print as possible, front and back, as many things as they could write down to prepare them for the test. And then one year, a student walked into class. He had a single piece of paper. It was blank. He put it on the floor, and an advanced logic student came and stood on the piece of paper. And throughout the entire test, he asked that other student for assistance on the exam, and on that day, he was the only one to have made an A on the exam. He understood the value of a person to help him. As we stand before that judge, we are grateful to have one, a person, Jesus Christ, who makes available to us the righteousness and justice of God so that it can flow through us into the lives of those who need it. John would tell us, 1 John chapter 2, if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous, the just one. So at the end of all of this, we thank God for making his righteousness and justice available to us in his Son. And may we not be intimidated by cultural forces who would twist and abuse that term, and instead seek to be those who want to see injustices overcome and righted through the love and the Word of God. Tonight, if you know that you are outside of Christ, that you do not stand saved before God, would you choose tonight as the night that you put Christ on in baptism so that he will save you, give you a new life, a transformed life as a new creation? We'd love to see you make that decision tonight. If you know that you've left his side, you're no longer living faithfully before him, this invitation time is open for you as well. We'd love to pray with you and for you. Please know that we are here for you because God is here for you. Would you come as we sing?